Welcome to Coffee and Regs.
Hi, everybody. Greg Hotaling here with CSS. And today let's talk about a certain aspect of shareholder disclosure for your holdings in listed issuers in France. So if you're at a compliance role at a market participant, such as an asset manager or investment manager, you probably already know that part of your job in investment monitoring is to make filings with regulators all around the world, wherever you have holdings, based on thresholds you reach in issuers in that jurisdiction. France has that as well. You need to make those disclosures to the AMF in France, the regulator for that purpose. But what France does in addition to that, much more so than any other jurisdiction, is they require you to make filings separately to issuers based on what each individual issuer says the thresholds are for your particular filings. So that's right. You have one regime from the AMF, which requires disclosures at 5% and higher thresholds, and then many, many other regimes by individual listed issuers in France, also making you, requiring you to make those similar filings. Now, those filings are required at these issuers' own individual separate thresholds that can vary from issuer to issuer. And so if you have holdings in, a lot of issuer names that are pretty well known impose these. So names like Total, Danone, L'Oreal, Airbus, Société Générale, BNP Paribas. The vast majority of blue chip issuers in France have these disclosure requirements, again, in addition to what the AMF requires. And in addition to that, small and medium-sized issuers in France impose these as well. I led a research project on this issue, on these regimes a few years ago here at CSS, and we found that about 1,000 issuers listed on French markets impose these requirements. So it can be pretty onerous. It can be kind of a time constraint on your compliance department. A lot of resources you may have to devote to this, especially if you hold a lot of issuer names listed in France. These would be, for the most part, listed on Euronext Paris, by the way. So they vary from issuer to issuer, not just the thresholds that are imposed, which can start as low as 0.5%, but also the calculations that you need to perform in order to understand what your percentage is in the first place. So some issuers are fine with just submitting your percentage threshold disclosure based on the straight equity you hold, but others want you to count convertibles, for example, where you may have to count derivatives as well. It depends from issuer to issuer on what's required. Another thing that can vary from issuer to issuer are the subsequent thresholds. So not just that initial one that I mentioned at 0.5%, but also 2, 3, 5, 10%. Those disclosures can also be required. You may also have to disclose for reducing your holdings and crossing those thresholds on the way down. So it can get pretty complicated. You can't just rely on one basic rule or set of thresholds across France for this. Again, they vary. Another aspect of this that varies is the notification requirements regarding the deadlines, the forms that are required, and also the manner in which you have to submit your notification. So the deadlines we found vary from about 4 to 15 days. Upon crossing that threshold, you have to submit the notification to the issuer about from 4 to 15 days later, depending on the issuer. The form required, generally just a letter, very simple, with certain brief pertinent information, such as the number of shares or voting rights you hold. Obviously, identify yourself as the shareholder and the percentage you hold, but that can vary from issuer to issuer. And there's no standard form across issuers that you can use necessarily. We found that some shareholders will use the AMF standard form, which is likely to be sufficient in many cases, but you need to consult the issuer requirements really to be able to confirm that. Another aspect that varies from issuer to issuer is the method of submission that you need to employ to make those filings. So for the most part, issuers in France will require you to submit it by letter, registered mail with return receipt requested. That's a pretty common form of legal and business communication in France generally, and this is no exception. for most issuers. However, some will allow you to submit the notifications by email. So that makes things a little bit easier. But again, you have to do your research and see what the issuer says. Now, in doing that research, that also brings up another aspect of this, which can vary from issuer to issuer, which is where to find the information. So for the most part, you can find it in the articles of association of the issuer, buried deep within that document. Usually around the middle or towards the end of the document, you'll see the requirements spelled out, but usually not in full. So while they may state the thresholds that trigger these notification requirements, and usually they'll state the deadline, to get information such as what type of securities count for your holdings is more difficult. And that's rarely, I've rarely seen that stated in the articles of association of the issuer. Another place you can try to look for this type of information is the issuer's website at their investor relations section. But again, the information about what asset types count is rarely addressed there either. So that's, those kind of nuances are matters that warrant a phone call or an email directly to the issuer. When we did this project here, because we sourced a lot of this information manually ourselves, on this project I mentioned, we were on the phone with the issuer. You have to obviously consider the time difference and have French speakers to be able to do that. It makes it a lot more helpful or a lot easier. So yeah, that's, there are a lot of things you need to consider. Another thing you should keep in mind is that France is quite unique in providing for penalties in its commercial code for not complying with these individual issuer requirements. So while you do see these types of issuer requirements in other jurisdictions, in other countries, first of all, they're not nearly as prevalent. Like I said, in France, we find many of them. About 1,000 different issuers impose them. But also in these other jurisdictions, it's really a private matter between the issuer and the shareholder. Now in France, it is too, strictly speaking, but the French commercial code, unlike in most other jurisdictions, does specifically state that if you as a shareholder, a market participant, an investment manager, don't comply with the issuer notification requirements, then the issuer is entitled to strip you of your voting rights. So if you're concerned as a market participant, not only with maintaining good relations with the issuer, but also with preserving your voting rights when you make these investments, that's something to keep in mind for these French issuer threshold requirements.
This has been another episode of Coffee and Regs.